Ladies and gentlemen, I wasn't going to say anything, but Mike said I should say something, and I thought he was quite right. I should at least thank everyone for being here, especially our speakers, of course, and to all of you, because the idea today was that we should have a fairly small and rather specialized group of people to make it possible for us to have a discussion, which is what we will do when we move into sort of seminar mode after lunch. So I hope you'll feel free to take part in the discussion. There's plenty of time allowed for that. And as you know, we're going to be filmed and recorded, and then all this will be put up on various websites. I hope everybody will put it up on their website, or will put the link up on their website so that we get some exposure for what's intended to be a contribution to a discussion. Perhaps it's too ambitious to say a national discussion, but at least a discussion among interested people. We're going to spend the day in this room because we found by experience that it actually lends itself to discussion, slightly counterintuitively, but it does. And the acoustics are quite good if you speak up, and the seats are comfortable. So we'll be spending the time in here, and we'll be having lunch and tea in the Lightfoot room, which is just down one floor through the back staircase. Lunch is intended for those who are going to be here all day, really, but there's enough lunch for everybody, so you're all very welcome to come and have lunch and tea. And then in the evening there will be supper for those who they know who they are because they've paid or they've been told that they're invited free, i.e. the speakers. But nevertheless, I hope we shall have a sort of convivial as well as interesting day. And for this, I want to thank St. John's for their generous support and cooperation of the college in every way. And also the history faculty has, somewhat to my relief, let me know the day before yesterday that they too are going to contribute. If they hadn't done, I suppose I might have ended up paying for some of it myself, but as it is, I shan't have to do that. The intention was to have speakers and an audience representing a range of interests and disciplines and points of view. So there are historians, political scientists, sociologists, lawyers, and people actively involved in politics and journalism. And there's also a spread of political views. The Labour Party is quite well represented in one way or another, as is the Conservative Party. I did invite some Lib Dems, but apparently they're all too busy. And I did invite our sitting MP, who couldn't come. At least he didn't reply. So I gathered that the present leadership of the Labour Party hasn't quite worked out its views on England yet. But he did convey a message, or at least I take it as such, through the front page story in today's Cambridge News, in which he warns that the important British value of queuing is being lost. So that, I think, is something for us all to think about. Because our themes are the changing ideas of Englishness and the particular responses to them. I keep thinking of something that Edmund Burke said at the time of the American Rebellion. No one listened to him, of course. We must govern America according to its true nature and not according to our own imaginations and not according to abstract theories. And he thought its true nature was included as a desire for self-government. Is that true today of England? And if so, is it to be deplored or welcomed? Should it be given political expression, or should ways be found of trying to muffle that expression? I hope to have a clearer idea on these matters after listening to our distinguished speakers and to our no less distinguished audience. But of course, what we discuss will be really up to you. So I want to hand over to the speakers in this morning's session who will set some of our agenda for the rest of the day. Krishan Kumar, who's the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. He received his undergraduate education in Cambridge, indeed in this very college, and his postgraduate education at the LSE. Among his most recent books, and you will have seen them downstairs, one of them, which are relevant to our topic today, are The Making of English National Identity, and then what in some sense is the catalyst for today's meeting, the idea of Englishness, English culture, national identity and social thought. And thank you very much, Krishan, for being willing to make the trip and to visit your old college. And then it's going to be discussed by Professor Michael Kenny, who's director of the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary, and was a founding editorial board member of the journal New Political Economy, and among his works are The Politics of Identity, Liberal Political Theory and the Dilemmas of Difference, and The Politics of Nationhood in England, published last year by Oxford University Press. And the other discussant is Tristram Hunt, also from Queen Mary, where he's senior lecturer in modern British history. He did his PhD at Cambridge, and as well as being a well-known broadcaster, he's the author of Building Jerusalem, The Rise and Fall of the Victorian City, The Frock-Coated Communist, The Revolutionary Life of Friedrich Engels, and 10 Cities That Made an Empire. And when he's not writing and teaching history, he is also Labour MP for Stoke Central and has served as Shadow Secretary of State for Education. So it's a great pleasure to have them here. Thank you again for coming. So I'm going to hand over to Krishan, who will be speaking from the lectern. And in order not to lose any of your words, I'm going to ask you to use this.
Well, thank you all for being here. And let me also particularly thank Robert Toombs and Mike Kenny, who are the two organizers of this conference. I think I ought to say straight away that Robert was kind enough to mention my book, The Idea of Englishness, as in some sense giving them the idea for having this conference. But we should also, I think, remember, and I think most of you probably know, that both of them have produced major works on this subject within the last year or two. Michael Kenny's The Politics of English Nationhood, Robert's massive The English and Their History, both of which have wonderful contributions to make of a very different kind. So I hope and expect that even though, of course, I would like some discussion of some of the themes of my book, we would draw very much equally on the contributions of the books by Michael Kenny and Robert Toombs. Now, one other thing perhaps I should say, I haven't lived in this country for many years. I've been living in the United States since 1996. Now, there are obviously advantages and disadvantages in being in that position. The disadvantages are that I've not been party to the kind of day-by-day discussions, listening to the news, reading the newspapers on a daily business, chatting about the subject in the pubs and things like that. So I've missed all that, and that's probably something that I need to know more about, and I hope some of the people here who've been, I know many of you have been active contributors to these debates over the years, and I've read many of you on that subject. So that, I hope, will fill the gap. But the advantage might well be that, you know, when you're abroad, away, some of the noise and clutter gets filtered out, and you hope you get a kind of more detached and clearer sense of what's going on. At least that has to be my hope, that even though I haven't been living in this country for many years, although I lived for most of my life in England, that the fact that I haven't been here won't perhaps be too much of a disadvantage. Now, although the focus of today's workshop is political Englishness in the very recent period, 1990 to 2015, I hope we'll be talking about Englishness perhaps in other forms as well, and perhaps also from the point of view of other periods. Because I think what we will all need, and I'm sure most of us feel this, is some kind of historical perspective on the whole question. And so what I'm going to do is lay out just a few themes and questions. I don't want to state a position, although I think that might come out, and certainly I hope to contribute something along those lines during the day. But the opening lecture, I think, should be questions as much as statements about where one stands. So that's what I'm going to do. And some of these do have a kind of historical reach to them. So let me just, and I'll probably just read this so I don't ramble for too much. I'll start off with what I call moments of Englishness. the word moment there having this slightly kind of Hegelian sense of a particular point in time when something crystallizes. In one of the books I wrote, The Making of English National Identity, I identified what I call the moment of Englishness in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was, I thought, a largely cultural moment involving things like tidying up the English language, English poetry, architecture, music, and folk song. That was what seemed to me to be the moment of Englishness in the late 19th century. Others have identified other periods as moments, without, of course, necessarily calling them such. They can really go back a long way. People like Patrick Wormald and Adrian Hastings have thought that the time of the Reverend Bede or King Alfred has been the moment when Englishness was defined. I think Patrick Wormald even went so far as to find English nationalism in Bede and thought that really everything that needed to be said about the English was more or less said by the Reverend Bede. I'm not entirely convinced by that, but I think one should hold in mind the possibility that there have been these successions of moments of Englishness. For other people, it's the 14th century, the age of Chaucer and Langland and Wycliffe. Others still, it's been the Tudor period. That's been a popular period. I think this goes back to the Victorian age when they saw a certain kind of Englishness crystallizing in the age of Elizabeth. Some people have found the English 17th century Civil War a moment, particularly if one puts the stress on the religious character of a certain kind of Englishness, Protestantism, a certain kind of Protestantism. That's made the English Civil War popular. And another popular period is the 18th century. I think particularly the work of a figure like Gerald Newman, he calls it the rise of English nationalism, and he attaches it particularly to Francophobia. It's the feelings against France that defined a certain kind of Englishness. So what all these moments have in common is the idea that these were periods in which a certain idea of England and Englishness crystallized, was given form and expression. Of course, their proponents give priority as the original foundational moment to their selected periods, but we can decide that each suggests different facets or different facets of or different contributions to the English idea. They may not be mutually exclusive, in other words. The alternation or variation of cultural and political modes might be one particularly useful way of thinking about the contributions of different periods. So the question then is, today, are we currently experiencing another such moment, another moment of Englishness? Do current concerns suggest such a thing? Does the evidence support it? Is it primarily political, the result especially of devolution, or cultural? And I rely very much on Michael Kenny's work here for the argument that there's also been a very strong upsurge of cultural Englishness in the recent period. Or, of course, it could be both, political and cultural. Does the term English nationalism best capture what is emerging? English nationalism always sounds to me a strange term. It doesn't seem to be quite English in itself. But nevertheless, quite a few people do seem to want to talk about English nationalism today, whether they thought it started earlier, but certainly that there's something going on today. Of a somewhat more academic concern, we might say, but you know, we're here in a university. How does the present moment compare with past moments? Is each unique and historically contextual? Or is there some sort of meta-historical way of thinking, of linking them up? Is Englishness an emergent property, a succession of discoveries and definitions, each adding their own characteristic ingredient, whether of politics, religion, race, culture? Or is there some distinctive and definitive moment in the discovery of England and Englishness? And here I think we should think that if there is an idea of the English nation emerging, and above all, if there's the idea of English nationalism emerging, we should link this to general theories and ideas about when nationalism as an ideology itself emerged. presumably there can't really be a kind of English nationalism without the concept of nationalism, and that's a 19th century European invention. So to me, at least, that was one reason for regarding all prior moments of so-called Englishness or English nationalism as premature, as anachronistic, because the very idea of nationalism seems to be a 19th century thing, and so any idea of England as a nation, English nationalism, is 19th century or later. But it seems to me that's something we should think about. So that's the first theme, the periodization in these particular moments of Englishness. The second one I see is Englishness and Britishness. I think it's interesting that what Gerald Newman reads as evidence for the rise of English nationalism in the 18th century, Linda Colley sees as the expression of a developing British consciousness. They could be both right, of course. For many people, the one doesn't exclude the other. But it's clear that there's massive confusion, both in the scholarly literature and in popular speech, especially in England, between the two, between Englishness and Britishness. So the question then is, how important is that for understanding contemporary expressions of Englishness? Do most English readily distinguish between English and British? If so, has that been increasing in recent years? Is Britishness in decline, as claimed by many, and is devolution the cause, perhaps the main cause? Is the English dog, after centuries of docility, finally barking, subduing the British lion's roar? There's another possibility, which is that the rise of the English question is a rather short-term, Westminster-generated kind of problem. This has been suggested very recently in a little book by David McCrone and Frank Beckhofer, who've been doing tons of work on this subject over the last 15 to 20 years from their base in Edinburgh, comparing English and Scottish attitudes towards the nation. They suggest that the whole English question has been a response to attempts by the politicians at Westminster, especially Labour politicians such as Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, to dampen nationalist feeling by playing up United Kingdom and British loyalties. In other words, and their idea is that Britishness is a reaction to a rather artificially reasserted Britishness on the part of the Labour politician. Just to quote what they say, we might take the pragmatic view that the emergence of the English question took place under the peculiar and highly specific circumstances of a Labour government at Westminster with a Scottish Prime Minister and a Scottish cabinet, in the context of an ascendant Scottish National Party north of the border, together with Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish devolution, under attack from an overwhelmingly, in terms of seats, English Conservative Party. That's quite a mouthful, but I hope you get the point. Now, they agree that to reduce the English question in this way may be going a bit too far. But it does seem to be worth asking, to what extent is the English question, as much as the British question, Westminster generated? How far are they the result of party politics, and how far expressions of something deeper, both in terms of what they show now and in terms of when they began, what the origins are? Both Michael Kenny and McCrone Beckhofer, for instance, argue that the decline of Britishness, which they do accept has occurred, the decline of Britishness and the rise of an English national consciousness precede the devolutionary measures of the 1990s, stretching back to the 1970s at least. Devolution, therefore, may not be the main cause of these developments, though it must surely intensify them. But it seems worthwhile to consider the significance of short-term, contingent, and contextual factors in contemporary expressions of Englishness, especially when they take on political dimensions. For one thing, that might give us a sense of how important they are to ordinary English people and whether they will fluctuate in force depending on party and electoral politics. But under this general theme of Englishness and Britishness, I suppose the most important thing to consider here might well be the extent to which, for many English people, an English identity is coming to replace, if not obliterating entirely, a British identity. Are the English finally sorting out the English-British conflation and confusion, as the Scots and others in these islands seem to have done for some time? Are they rejecting Britishness in favour of an assertive Englishness? Are they indeed becoming English nationalists? And is that perhaps different from English patriotism? There are all these terms that one uses: English national identity, English national consciousness, English nationalism, and they all seem to have a somewhat different kind of flavour. They point in different directions. We may be talking about a series of different forms of identity that don't all merge under the heading of something like English nationalism. That seems to be something that maybe we should think about. The polls, the opinion polls, as is well known, are not entirely clear on this, i.e. on the question of whether the English really have sorted out the English-British confusion. But their evidence is surely suggestive. And I was interested to find that Macron and Beckhofer, in this recent little book of theirs called Understanding National Identity, said they were surprised at the fact that the Scots seemed to show so much more attachment to Britishness than they had expected. They've been conducting these polls for the last 20 years, and they thought they saw a really significant decline of Britishness in Scotland, and obviously a very strong assertion of Scottish national identity. And they were then surprised to discover, in more recent times, the way in which the Scots seemed to be much more loyal to the idea of Britain than they expected. And they wondered whether it was their method that had deceived them. They rely, like a lot of people, on this so-called Moreno scale. You know, the thing where you're asked to say, are you more English than British? Are you half English, half British? You go down the list and you tick whichever applies to you. They think that might have misled them. I think it'd be interesting to think about the ways in which we measure and think about questions of national identity relying on these opinion polls, which has been, I think, the source of much of the debate about this over the last 20 years, and something perhaps that Michael will want to comment on. Okay, my third theme, Englishness and Europe. An obvious one, obviously, with a referendum coming up on continuing British membership of the European Union. But this will surely also raise the question specifically of English attitudes to Europe, as the Scottish referendum raised the question of Scotland and Europe and told us something of the differences between the Scottish and the English in their attitudes to Europe. The Scots, of course, having a rather more favourable attitude to Europe than the English have historically done. So how far is Englishness defined, not so much against Scottish, Welsh and Irish identities as against Europe, the continent, Europe in, of course, the way the English think of Europe as being separate from England. This has been, of course, an assumption in much of the literature for a very long time. I think particularly of that famous headline in the Times, I think somewhere around 1914, fog in channel, continent cut off. Kind of the idea being that it was the continent that was cut off, not that England had been cut off, but somehow England was very, very different and defined itself against the continent. The continentals have reciprocated warmly with notions such as perfidious Albion and a whole series of other pejorative terms, as I think both Isabel and Robert have written wonderfully about in their book, That Sweet Enemy. Now, some scholars seem to think that anti-European sentiment is still the driving force of English nationalism. And are they right about that? Is Euroscepticism really what's pushing the rise, if it is a rise, of English national consciousness today? And if so, in what ways does anti-Europeanism shape English national identity? And how might that differ from the shaping effect of others? Scots, Welsh, Irish, and perhaps also we should think further afield of the other English-speaking peoples, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, the peoples that Sir John Seeley might have called the English abroad. How much part do those people play in somehow suggesting ideas of Englishness from quite a long way away from this country? I think that's something that I feel is an important dimension to bring in, that the circle around Englishness can really be defined in a very broad way. There's the further possibility that a variety of English might develop not against Europe, but through it. Robert refers in his book on the English and their history to what he calls Blairite Europhilia. Nice term, Blairite Europhilia. Now, I think that would be something relatively new if the English define themselves through Europe rather than against it. And I'd be interested to know what the contours of such a definition might be. I was trying to think about this myself. What do we draw upon for that? Europhiles are normally thought of as cosmopolitans, not nationalists. But post-war Germany has sought some sort of national identity by becoming the model European country, though of course that is a way of offsetting a rather problematic past, so one can see why the Germans might want to declare themselves the model Europeans, and I think Italy is the other country which has been shown very strong Europeanness, and they too have a bit of a problem about their past to overcome. But is there a European route to Englishness? What are the precedents for this? What are the tools to hand for constructing such a notion? The Scots and the Irish have, it seems, blended European and national identity in the past. One thinks of people like Edmund Burke or James Joyce. I think in both cases you get the Europeanness and the nationalness in their cases. Is there a similar English tradition? And if there is, I couldn't really think of one, but I'd be really interested to know if there is. All this raises the question of how far Englishness, as with national identities in general, has a content, the cultural stuff of national identity, as Frederick Bath put it, and how far is it a relatively empty space waiting to be filled with a variety of contents depending on time and circumstances? Should we join in the old pursuit of trying to define the English national character, the kind of tradition that Peter Mandler outlined in his book, The English National Character? Or is that just a will-o'-the-wisp? You know, we all these days are somewhat cautious about talking about national character, at least in the academy. That's not a phrase that achieves much credibility. But I think for other people, it still has quite a bit of purchase, the whole idea of national character. Certainly in common speech it does. Is Englishness an open signifier, as Robert Young has put it in his book, The Idea of English Ethnicity, capable of an almost infinite number of inflections depending on religion, race, class, region, and so on? Is Englishness, the further question, is Englishness only to be defined by the native by the native English, or can others, not necessarily living in these islands, join in? My point about the Americans, the Australians, the Canadians, and so on. So that's my third theme is Englishness and Europe. And then fourthly, this brings in, I think, the theme of Englishness and race. The subject of race and how far Englishness is racialized, the preserve of the white English. Does one, in the eyes of the English, but perhaps not only they, have to be white to be English? Some of the polling evidence surveyed by McCone and Beckhofer certainly seems to suggest so. In their survey, they looked at a series of surveys on this question. More than 17% of white English reject as English even those non-white English citizens who were born and brought up in England. The Scots are less racist here. Only about 12% think you have to be white to be Scottish. But in England, 17% think you have to be white to be English. A revealing finding is among those of Asian or Caribbean origin who are born and brought up in England and who think of themselves as English but don't feel they can publicly claim English identity because they think this would be rejected by the white majority. The expected response, as one of them put it, is, hang on, you're not white, how can you be English? I have to say, myself, as somebody who was of Indian origin and who was not actually born in this country, but spent most of my life here before I went to America, I've often felt that myself, that although I don't really have any other culture except English culture, and certainly no other language, I've always found it difficult to say to myself I am English because I'm not sure that the other English, particularly white English, would accept that. So that comment, hang on, how can you be? You're not white, how can you be English? Is something I think quite a few people feel. Such people settle for the safer and more capacious designation of Britishness. even though it seems that for them, Englishness would be the more accurate description. Now, a complication in all this would be the famous claim in the so-called PAREC report, the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, the Runnymede report that came out in 2000, which claimed that even Britishness spells whiteness. I don't think that claim was accepted at the time, and I think since that time, even Bhikkhu PAREC has retracted from that idea that Britishness is itself a kind of white designation, but possibly that still hangs around as a complicating factor. Now, it does seem clear that there are among the current generation, the younger Asians, people of Asian and Caribbean origin, quite a few black and brown people, especially those of mixed race background, who do think of themselves as English and feel confident enough to say so. But this is another area where we can see countercurrents rather than some straightforward process of assimilation. There are the various assertions, particularly among the young, of black or Asian identity, particularly, of course, ones linked to the Muslim religion. These mostly take cultural form, but as we know today, they can very readily be politicized. And then on the other hand, also from among the white majority, there are various groups and parties that continue to stress race as a criterion of national membership. So far, these groups have had limited success, but that tells us little about their future fortunes. There are ideas and events enough in the contemporary world to make race, even if understood primarily in cultural terms, as what Tariq Madood calls cultural racism, there are ideas enough to make race a key component of national identity, one that would have significant impact on ideas of Englishness. If Britain were to secede from Europe, and/or if the United Kingdom were to break up, one might expect the force of the factor of race to increase, not decrease. Okay, so the four topics I've mentioned so far, moments of Englishness, Englishness and Britishness, Englishness and Europe, Englishness and race, would seem to give us plenty to talk about during the day. But there are just two more. If you give me just a few more minutes, is that okay, Robert? 2 more minutes or so to mention 2 more topics that I would like us to think about, at least. Empire is one of them, at least in the form of a question: is empire still relevant in thinking about Englishness? I have made it central to my own discussion of English national identity, arguing that its influence persisted well beyond the time that the empire was wound up in the 1950s and 1960s. But there are others, such as the historian Bernard Porter in his book The Absent-Minded Imperialist, who have strenuously denied that the empire had much impact on English or British national consciousness, or indeed on English and British society generally. I do find that claim a little bit unconvincing, I have to say. Polling evidence suggests that while the English have only a vague idea of what the British Empire was, I mean, one poll suggested that they thought that America was part of the British Empire in the 1940s. While they have only a vague idea of what the British Empire was, they are aware that there was an empire, the largest in the world, and more to the point, they take pride in having had an empire. And they're also aware that while the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish all played their part in the empire, the English were the dominant group, and that the empire was, in some sense, an English empire. What does this pride in empire and of England's role in it mean? How does it affect English self-conceptions? To have been a great imperial people, with all that that means by way of pride, but also perhaps of guilt, which is something that does show up in the polls as well. Can one simply be a nation and forming a nation state after all that? After that experience of empire, in the case of the English, it's not just the overseas empire that was constructed from about Tudor times onwards, but the medieval English empire, which involved conquering the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish. So the English have been an imperial people for about at least 1,000 years. It's a long time, a long legacy. Can they simply throw that off and say, yeah, we're just a nation state like any other nation state? The Dutch and the Belgians, who of course also had big empires, perhaps have managed that. Maybe also the Austrians have settled for being a cozy little bit of Central Europe. But what about other imperial peoples like the Turks, the Russians, perhaps also the French? They seem to have had much more trouble shaking off an imperial past. How do the English compare with these other imperial peoples in terms of how they relate to that imperial past? The very attempt to bury the empire, as sometimes occurs, and I think particularly Enoch Powell is a wonderful example of somebody who was originally quite an imperialist, but then later on began to argue that the British really had never had an empire. It was all an accident and it was easily forgotten. But that very attempt to bury the empire might betray the fear of its lingering presence. So it seems to me empire still remains a relevant topic even today. And my final topic is what I call global Englishness. This is a more speculative topic. England and or Britain did not just have the world's largest empire, it also had and continues to have one of the world's most encompassing cultures, comparable perhaps to the way that the Roman culture spanned the, of course, much smaller ecumeny of its time. This is, of course, owing to other English-speaking peoples, the Americans above all, as much as to the English themselves. But it's nevertheless worth, I think, pondering the implications of this for ideas of Englishness today. While there is some sign that knowledge of the English language is declining in areas where it once held sway, for instance in India or in Hong Kong, where English is no longer quite as common as it used to be, it does remain true, I think, that English is still the world's lingua franca. Globalization has spread it beyond the confines of the old empire. English writers, from Shakespeare to J.K. Rowling, continue to have worldwide readerships, if mostly in translation. The BBC still commands respect across the world. There's more interest in English royalty than in the doings of any other of the dozens of royal families. If football is the world sport, then English football and English clubs, despite their performance, are held in more affection across the world than is the case with any other society. The English, after all, invented football as they did most other modern sports. So what is the effect of this global English culture on English conceptions of national identity? Can it really not affect the way the English think about themselves? One should like to think that it works at least against a narrow form of English nationalism. At any rate, it's hard to think that there is no effect as to consider how we might actually go around measuring it. But this leads me to my very final point about method. I think we should be careful not to think that empirical inquiries through surveys and polls and the like are the best or the only way to study national identities. Even educated people often don't know what they think when confronted by questions about national identities. The replies to such questions have to be treated with caution. We need to think of multiple ways of approaching national identity: historical, cultural, literary, as well as political. A good deal of national identity lies beneath the ground, waiting to be activated in the appropriate circumstances, whether of war or sport, to take the two most obvious. And I will stop at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, well, thank you very much. Krishan has tabled a terrific set of questions there. And just to be clear, I'm not going to take it upon myself to try and answer them all. I'm sure Tristram will have a stab at some of them too. There are a few points I am going to pick up, as well as developing questions about thinking about political Englishness and how we ought to understand that. But I wanted to begin just by acknowledging the great effort that Robert has put in to preparing for today, because these sort of events, as you know, take a lot of work and a lot of time. But I also want to salute his vision, which I was very struck by when we first discussed this idea. It was the vision of an event that would bring together scholars who typically live in separate academic fields with some of the leading politicians, writers and commentators on the national identity and constitutional position of the English. And this is quite an unusual academic cross-fertilisation, and I think myself it's especially valuable. It seems to me, as someone who's engaged a lot in academic debates and public debates about Englishness and what's driving it and what are its implications, it seems to me that the lack of a historical perspective has tended to skew the way in which many commentators think about this phenomenon. And history is quite widely assumed to begin in the very recent past, either with the Scottish referendum or a little bit further back with the introduction of devolution by the first Blair government. But among its many virtues, it seems to me, is that Robert's recent volume illustrates very well the deep lines of descent from which current expressions of Englishness derive. Krishan Kumar's work is equally suggestive in drawing attention to the singular importance of the late 19th century as the period when a widespread form of national consciousness coalesced among the English. And of course, that has spawned a number of very important subsequent historical debates, some of which he's referenced here. Some of the questions he poses today arise clearly from the longer view that he takes on this topic. In the opening essay to his new volume, and I strongly recommend the volume as a whole, but in that opening essay, he observes the need to retain a sense of some of the continuities affecting national identity and its perception among the English. And I think given the hyperbole and some of the dramatic rhetoric which the question of English nationalism attracts, that cautionary note is well made. But while history is important, I want to suggest that older approaches in this area may not entirely be up to the task of understanding political Englishness. Krishan echoes in a number of different writings one of the most deeply rooted historical perspectives on English nationhood, that which sees it as defined, in a sense, by its lack of definition. Does it, as many have suggested, lack the kind of cultural resources, the cultural stuff, as he put it, for the task of modern nation building? Can the English develop and embrace a sense of themselves as a people, as a sovereign people, given how deeply they have invested in the institutional, legal and civic structures associated with the British state? Such doubts and concerns have a long pedigree. Let me just select one of a potential myriad of examples. This is Henry James, that very shrewd observer of the English character, talking in the Golden Bowl of, quote, the fathomless depths of English equivocation. That sort of willful indeterminacy that James regarded a touch disparagingly, it should be said, has long been an object of celebration and in veneration by numerous advocates of the British tradition. But, and this I think is the key question, recent developments compel us to ask whether the habit of equivocation is now passing. Do the English now desire more than just a residual sense of their own cultural heritage? Are they becoming interested in a more substantive degree of national representation and recognition within the systems of politics and governance with which they live? Has the idea of some kind of political community at the level of England become more prevalent and meaningful? My own answers to these questions are set out in my own book on this topic, which Robert and Krishan have mentioned, looking across a range of different kinds of evidence and research, and I'll come back to the polling point because I think it's an incredibly important one, that it seems to me polling has its uses but also ought to be kept in its place. But looking across different kinds of evidence and drawing on others' research, I was struck by the many different signs of a stronger and more meaningful, though still hugely varied, sense of Englishness in the last quarter century, as well as a still inchoate but growing interest in answering these political questions affirmatively. And importantly, these sentiments are shared across a range of different demographics and are, I think, reaching into some ethnic minorities too. So it's a very interesting question that Krishan tables. It does seem to me that actually things have changed quite importantly in a sort of attitudinal sense. And I think actually when we come to polling on these questions, the issue of what question is asked is incredibly important. And it does seem to me actually that there are sort of sometimes rather subterranean shifts that have happened on that issue that are not picked up in aggregate level polling. Now, if we want to look at if this is the trend, are there any outliers? The most obvious trend and the most obvious outlier to this generalized trend is in fact London and those who live there, where for the most part the older notion of a global Britain, which was crystallised under empire, remains very much alive and is now wedded to a very strongly metropolitan and multicultural ethos. This broad shift in national consciousness has not happened overnight, nor has it happened simply at the behest of David Cameron and the Conservative Party. England has emerged as a kind of imaginative horizon and a rich source of meaning over some considerable time. This multifaceted development has, of course, been recognised only gradually and with some reluctance in the worlds of policy, of high politics, in much of the London-based media, and indeed in the academy. And in those communities, there are, of course, concerns for the consequences to the UK's territorial constitution of a less equivocal and more self-conscious English national identity. But those who wish the union to continue do seem to me to be called now to ponder whether a settlement that is perceived by a growing number as in some sense unfair or indeed unbalanced needs to be reconfigured if it is to survive. And I think they need also to ask if the shifting national sentiments of the English need now to be accommodated in various ways, more clearly in the structures of governance and representation within the UK. Now that, broadly put, of course, is the justification, or part of the justification, for the government's complex and cumbersome, but symbolically important, reforms to the House of Commons, known under the rather unfortunate acronym of EVIL, English Votes for English Laws. Now that may not be the only motivation for that reform, but undoubtedly that is a widely shared justification for them. What, of course, those proposals reveal is how difficult it is to disentangle the English interest from the UK-wide legislature, and of course the unforeseen consequences that may flow from efforts to do so. More generally, it is vital to understand the complexities of Englishness and some of the abiding ambiguities that are associated, I think, with its political expression and mobilisation. Specifically, what I'd like to do here in the remaining part of my talk is just give space to two distinct but intersecting dynamics that are, I think, increasingly coalescing around this form of identification. The first concerns its cultural character, and I'm really interested by the remarks that Krishan has already made on this point. During my own research, and I for a social scientist, it's reasonably historical in that it goes back to the 1990s. I'm sure for the historians in the room, looks pretty tame stuff, but at least on that canvas, I was genuinely surprised actually by the extensive nature of the artistic and cultural focus in a whole range of different genres, from fashion to theatre, visual arts, film, TV, the blogosphere into popular culture as well. I mean, in many different ways from that period certainly, there is a sense of energy and significance, a sense of investment associated with the exploration, celebration, and of course critique of the notion of England and the traditions associated with it during this period. And in fact, when I was rather tentatively doing that work, I was increasingly drawn actually to Krishan's work on the moment of Englishness that he identified. I mean, there are some very interesting parallels actually between that particular period and the one that we're discussing here today, which may well be fruitful to consider. That's one of the dynamics that I think is terribly important. The second, and I think it's rather separate dimension of English sentiment, was thrown into relief during the recent election campaign and may well have done much to affect its outcome. This reflects a deeply rooted, generally latent sense of shared interest amongst English taxpayers. Broadly put, English tolerance of the territorial distribution of spending in Britain has been pretty elastic, actually, I think, in general terms, but it has also had its limits. And wise rulers have long understood this. Questions about the distribution of funding and indeed the sharing of the burden of national debt were familiar themes, as many of you will know, in centuries past in political discourse. The fear that surfaced in the run-up to this year's election, that an incoming Labour government might be unduly swayed by Scottish interests, by the SNP in particular, has a long historical pedigree. But it was rendered especially potent because of many voters' doubts about the party's leadership and economic competence. But some factors germane to the rise of political Englishness are, I think, of more recent vintage. Europe is indeed one. I concur with Krishan's stress upon that. So too, obviously, is the issue of the Scottish referendum and the deal, as it were, that was rather hurriedly made to the Scots in advance of that particular poll. I just want to give just a little bit of time to another factor that I think doesn't get enough airtime in these kind of discussions, but it seems to me is tremendously important. And that is what I would see as a marked intensification of angst about London, and the sense that this has become, in some sense, an unaccountable behemoth where economic opportunity, political authority, rising property prices, the arrival of the global super-rich have generated a new, fundamentally unaccountable nexus of power and wealth. Now, provincial resentments towards London are, of course, nothing new, but I think in the era of the rise of anti-politics and as the very notion of self-government has entered the ether, that sense of resentment or of disquiet seems to me to have been given a very powerful boost and is, I think, part of the story of the phenomenon we're looking at today. So these different factors have, I think, combined to forge an increasingly durable bridge between the cultural resurgence and the sharper sense of collective interest felt by many of the English, a more territorially defined sense of interest. And in this context, the growing imperative for a much less equivocal and more sharply delineated sense of England has grown apace. And yet, in two important respects, equivocation or an equivocal note probably does still need to be struck, and I'm just going to finish with those two notes. First, it is important to bear in mind how contestable this form of identification remains in political terms, a point that will, I expect, not come to as much of a surprise to historians here familiar, for instance, with radical constructions of the people in earlier periods in British history. But in the current one, English identities have been corralled behind or in the service of very different kinds of political narrative and what I would call representative claim. Sometimes about the position of disadvantaged social groups or the white working class, at other times in favour of a more roundly democratic territorial system. A whole range of different kinds of claims have emerged based upon the imagined community of England. And in fact, this makes the question, I think, of its political implications more indeterminate than most commentary, particularly liberal commentary, I think, tends to realise. Contrasting images of England's cultural character and geopolitical future abound, drawing upon a rich and varied intellectual heritage. So whether England becomes, as what one commentator has called, the shrinking island that turns away from its wider entanglements and alliances, or if it reinvents itself as the world island with a distinctive European role, will ultimately be determined at the level of the imagination as well as in the realm of high politics. There's a second equivocal note to finish on. It seems to me important that we come to a more nuanced understanding of how England relates to other place-based identities within its borders. While I think some have fallen in both in the political world, in the policy world certainly, and that was very much true I think under the new Labour governments, but I think it's true of academics too. There's the habit of seeing local or regional attachments as rivals to or alternatives to national affiliation has, I think, become quite deeply rooted. But in the real world, where multiple identities are lived and balanced, these things are often connected and can be mutually reinforcing as well, sometimes obviously sources of tension. But Englishness is expressed through a range of different accents, and it is accessed quite typically through local cultures and traditions and ways of and forms of community. And it seems to me that achieving a richer, better grasp, perhaps, to use that cliched term, something from the bottom up, rather than necessarily always looking from the top down, achieving a richer grasp of the everyday ways in which English identities are lived and reworked is in some ways perhaps more valuable than peering at the latest opinion surveys. And I very much agree with some of the slightly doubtful note that Krishan raised there about that particular methodology or those sources, important as polls are. It so happens that there is a great welter of social scientific research on these topics, which rarely gets into these discussions. But I think quite clearly there needs to be, certainly amongst my political science colleagues, and I think amongst social scientists more generally, a greater appreciation of the histories of the English and their shifting and continuing sense of imagined community. And as one of the few social scientists working in this area with such a historical perspective, Krishan is a rare flower. It is then all the more welcome and timely that we have him with us today, lending us his thoughts on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Robert, thank you very much for inviting me here today. Krishan, thank you very much for giving me a sight of your book. And I think I have to say I've rarely met anyone more English than yourself, so I'm more about that. I am both a historian and a politician, and probably enjoy the history more than the politics at the moment. And so thought I would start with that element of the discussion. And I think, touching on, in different parts, various elements of Krishan's talk and Mike's response, that stressing the Englishness and not just the Britishness of imperialism is quite a powerful point. I think when we go right back to the 1535 Act in Restraint of Appeals, and England is an empire, and when you begin then to trace that language through the 16th and 17th century, there is a Englishness around the imperial discourse, which is very, very strong and powerful prior to a British sensibility. And I think thinking of it both in terms of internal and external colonisation is powerful. In terms of that earlier Englishness moment, you do in sort of 1870s, 1910s, see that extraordinary moment of a sense of an imperial Anglo-Saxon family, the crimson thread of kinship, all of Chamberlain's vision of imperial federation. And I think what's so interesting there is actually the language of Englishness and Britishness are used in the discourse there very interchangeably. But when you have that concern about already the end of empire, there's a concern about the fall of the British Empire, but underneath that, a notion essentially of ethnic decline of Englishness. And what's so fascinating about the test matches with Australia, the emigration to South Africa, is this notion that Englishness could actually be transferred abroad, that actually the true ethnic heart of England would actually be better preserved in Johannesburg and Melbourne, because there you don't have terrible dirty cities, and you don't have worrying migration, and actually the sort of physical core of England could be transferred out of England to essentially the white colonies. As a result of which, I think actually, to go to your later point about Englishness and British identity in the modern era, was how non-white imperial subjects could much easily assume a British identity, and the multiple identities within that, which was of course the unnatural codification of the Norman Tebbit cricket test, that actually you could be a British citizen and support the Pakistani cricket team against England. So there were multiple layers of complexity within that. I think there is, as you also say in your chapter, the important role of historians within this. I think the great irony of the Linda Colley Britton's book was this was a text that Gordon Brown embraced with such fulsomeness, and he liked Linda, and David and Linda were there all the time. And what was the story of it? The story of it was the fragility of Britishness. And even at the time, then Gordon was trying to say, well, there was a sort of organic core to British identity. The core text around that was actually saying, well, there's a very fragile political construct around British identity. And if you remove empire, and if you remove Protestantism, and if you remove the French, well, actually, it sort of leaves. And I think much of that, as I'll come on to say, was exposed by the Scottish referendum. Which brings me to the politics and the modern moment of Englishness now. I do think we are seeing a resurgence of English identity and a moment of Englishness. And I think the chronology, I forget the names you pointed to, but the chronology of this goes further back than you suggested. I think Mike is right on the prehistory of this. You did have, alongside Gordon Brown, I think, talking about trying to create a golden thread of Britishness, you did have that sort of voguish mid-90s moment of almost a sort of state-supported British identity of Cool Britannia and Team GB and those components. But it always felt as if it was fighting against much bigger, more organic forces. And it's a sort of straw in the wind, but I'm particularly struck by the fact that the two codifying buildings of Britishness, the Houses of Parliament and Buckingham Palace, are both falling down. And this seems to me to say something about the fragility of that. And again, the response of politicians, what's very interesting is that essentially as a result of fears of Islamist radicalization within our schools, we are now teaching British values, but British values are only taught in English schools because the Westminster government only has control over the English curriculum. But it's not English values in English schools, it's British values in English schools, which are consciously separate. That said, I do think it's worth just reflecting though, when I think, actually I'll retain that point till later. On the politics, the modern political geography is exacerbating the moment of Englishness. John Curtis is very powerful on this point, that we no longer have United Kingdom general elections. We have general elections in the component parts of the United Kingdom. And the election in Scotland is very different to the election in England and Wales. There are certainly fears that actually you will be heading towards one-party states in each different component part of the United Kingdom, and the political conversation between the component parts of the United Kingdom are becoming more and more discordant. And for the Labour Party, for a party of the Union, as we can see, this is particularly harrowing. Because we see essentially the Conservative Party and the Scottish Nationalist Party working together, each in their own interest, to support hegemony within their own component parts of the United Kingdom, and this has an effect. There is a. I'm going to be publishing some work on this, but there's the Labour Party candidate in Portsmouth, the wonderful man, council leader called John Ferret, describes brilliantly how in the last Parliament the British government made a decision to support the continuation of shipbuilding on the Clyde at the expense of Portsmouth. So here was a moment where essentially in the run-up to the referendum a political decision, as he sees it, was made to keep the Union together. And Portsmouth was, low-income, coastal, strong working class base, strong naval history, strong military history. This was an area where actually the Labour Party should be making real inroads into Tory seats. And the inability of the Labour Party to say, well, actually, we disagree with that decision, and actually we want to support shipbuilding in England. I mean, John will know much more about this than me, absolutely hammered the vote. So any attempt to have a sort of an English story there, because of the nature of the Union, was devastating in terms of the politics. I think the interaction between the fear, as Mike said, about Scotland and England and how that played into the Conservative victory. When you talk to Tories, what is very interesting is we saw these pictures of sort of Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon during the election campaign. The Tory strategists say that actually the November before the general election, so this time last year, in focus groups, the fear of Scotland and the fear of a Westminster government being dictated to by the Scottish Nationalist Party was coming up unasked. It was coming up unprompted. And so this was something deep. And I remember, again, talking to Tories during the election campaign, and once they began to motor on this, it just sighed through. It did absolutely, it was sort of, they were coming down the, A1 again. They were at Derby. It was a moment of sort of fear again, which just brought out the Tory vote. I think in terms of the Europe issue, I think there's an interesting argument there about how what the voters seem to want is a very strong patriotic voice within Europe. And actually, there's quite a strong feel for Britain, that Britain as a cohesive political unit actually has more power fighting our corner in Europe than just England would. But to go back to Scotland, the challenge we tell ourselves in the Labour Party is that, the narrative from the SNP is that the Scottish people are inherently, they are born left-wing, they're just left-wing people, and it's always been that way. And they're held back by reactionary England. And if there wasn't a reactionary England, then we could all get along together. But unfortunately, the English are reactionary and the Scottish are progressive. And so we in the Labour Party tell ourselves, well, we need a radical English narrative, and we need a story of English radicalism to counter that. And we all know the story, and it's the Diggers and the Levellers and Tolpuddle and Orwell and all the rest of it. And I like to buy into that as much as Billy Bragg, but I'm decreasingly confident about its currency and its ability. And this notion that we can counter that story in Scotland through a radical English story which actually has momentum. And maybe the solution to it actually is more regional, and the solution to it is more particular. Because part of the problem of that is that within this story of Englishness in the Labour Party, we have completely lost the nonconformist moment. We've completely lost Protestantism. Protestantism, it doesn't exist within the Labour Party in any cohesive sense. I got a lovely moment of it the other week, inevitably from a Ben. Hilary Benn gave a speech to the Labour Friends of Israel, and he began to speak about essentially his sort of the Ben Congregationalist story of philo-Semitism. And how on solid nonconformist lines the love of Israel and the spirit of Israel was a very strong component in their vision of England as Israel and the socialist story. But other than that, it's simply not there. I think actually, as we'll see in the May elections, that the Scottish story is much more about nationalism than it is about progressive politics. And again, my Scottish colleagues say the moment they knew that we were going to lose, that Unionists were going, they knew that we were going to lose in the general election and had lost the vote was when on the Celtic supporters website, the political conversation on the Celtic supporters website just saw the Catholic vote just go over to the SNP. And once that was gone for the Labour Party, that they felt that was a very powerful sort of signal of loss. So I think, and John Denham, my colleague, has written much more eloquently about that Labour does need to be clear about embracing this English moment and being more confident about England. When you get to grips about it out there, in far too many Labour communities, they essentially think the Labour Party puts foreigners first rather than people born here. They think we're sort of apologetic about England and Englishness and aren't confident about it. When it comes to the UKIP challenge, Europe, on the list of UKIP voters' priorities, Europe is about 7th. It's immigration and the effect on public services and a feeling of economic change and loss. And Europe is just a sort of sub-element of that. And it's for those reasons that when you look at the demographics of where the Labour Party was undone in England, yes, you know, we're big in London, yes, we're big in Manchester, yes, we're big in confident sort of global multicultural cities, in small towns, in market towns, in coastal towns, where you often have a stronger sense of an English identity, an English residual identity. We were being hammered, and I don't think the sort of mood music will change on that in the immediate future. Let me say finally a few things just about, as an elected representative and my constituency of Stoke-on-Trent, when constituents and the sort of debate in the city about England and Englishness. The English Premier League is an enormous thing, and Stoke City is a source of enormous pride in the city, and both is on the one hand, you know, and Robert's written very beautifully about this, on the one hand, the Stoke City support and the place of the football club in the city it has elements of feeling unchanged down the decades. And then yet, of course, you see the names of the players and where they're from. And immediately, it's a global story about England in the world. And then, you know, the stories in the local paper when the club are flying off for their friendlies in Singapore and their sort of promotions in Abu Dhabi. So there's a story of England in the world, which is interesting. And yet the big cultural sort of historical heritage moment in the city in the last decade was the unearthing of the Staffordshire hoard, this extraordinary find in the fields outside Lichfield of 7th, 8th century Saxon, you know, gold. And people queued round the block to see this. And it was, and you know, the most recent sort of big fight we had was to save the name of the Mercian regiment. So the idea of Mercia and sort of, you know, the Midlands and Middle England, and again a very sort of elemental English identity was there. And yet, to go to your point about, finally, about the survival of Britishness, one of the things all MPs have seen in the last 5-10 years, and maybe it's as a result of and it is partly a result of our greater military action around the world, the extraordinary resurgence of Remembrance Sunday events, just the numbers and the interests and the engagement. And we have, on Remembrance Sunday in Stoke-on-Trent, we will have 7 events just in Stoke-on-Trent, which will be incredibly well represented. Alongside a huge number of others in Staffordshire. So I think there is an Englishness moment, but that the interaction with that still residual British identity remains powerful.
Well, thank you to all our speakers for having got us off to a wonderfully good start. And we have a good half hour before lunch for a discussion. And in case I can be useful, I'm going to point to people, and so that our speakers can concentrate on their answers. And I think probably we can manage without passing around a microphone. We'll try anyway. So, who would like to begin? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. I think one of the difficulties that we face nowadays in terms of national identity is that now that globalization, multiculturalism is being taken as a given. You can't change it. Now the question is, how do you disengage notions of race and whiteness from national identity and Englishness? And being from Portugal, one thing I've always noticed among Portuguese people is that we always see English people as white, because migrant communities, and I know one of the speakers mentioned this, they always seem to be much more racially homogeneous than here in Britain. And that's a fundamental issue, because the way that other nations perceive England and Britain is usually very much still tied to whiteness. And so even though in London and in Manchester you might have all these Caribbean and Indian migrant communities which really change this notion of Englishness being attached to race, I think fundamentally there's an issue that in Europe, because of how migrant communities of English people are still perceived in such racially homogeneous terms, it's very hard to accept this notion of a British identity simply because of the way other nations perceive England and Englishness.
Thank you. Would any of you like to take a few? Yes, let's take a few. Okay. Yes, Martin.
Yes. Apologies if I break into coughing. Martin Kettle, I work for The Guardian. I've got 3 questions or 3 points I just want to throw into it at this stage. This is, as ever, a fascinating discussion about identity, and there is clearly, as the talks this morning have made clear, a great growth of academic interest in national identity and Englishness and Britishness and so on. I hesitate to say this, but do you think the Academy is to some extent driving this interest? Or to what extent do you think the Academy is driving this interest? And to what extent is it actually a concern to the degree that Mike in particular was claiming that it is? My second point is today, if you've been watching the TV or listening to the radio at all, you'll be well aware that today is something called Black Friday. And it's called Black Friday because it's a shopping frenzy day, wholly imported from the United States, very, very recently. But like a number of other things that are very noticeable about so-called British culture as it is lived. I listened on the radio last night to listening to 5 Live Sport, for my shame, in which people were talking about the National Football League, American NFL, American football, and how big that is becoming in America, in Britain, and how much there is a growing public for American football in Britain. And of course, a month ago we had Halloween, which has been transformed from what it once was into being a wholly American imported event. Just the point I'm getting at, I think, relates to something which Krishan was talking about, which is when you talked about Englishness and Europe, is there not a very real sense about Englishness and the United States? And rather in particular, the sense that the United States is somehow ours. And that we can bathe in the United States and it reflects well on us. I think this is a quite an interesting thought just to sort of put into it, that somehow or other it's important to understand modern Englishness, or modern English culture, in reference to its love affair. Its love affair. It's largely a working class love affair, if one can use that term. But it's love affair with the United States, not shared perhaps by more middle class people to that extent. My third point is, when you go to Berlin, as I do quite often, one of the most interesting things you can go and visit is the German Historical Museum on Unter den Linden. And it's not unique in, Germany is not unique in having a national historical museum. And why it should have one and why it takes the form that it does, we all can see. I've got a question to the panel, which is, can you imagine a museum of British history or a museum of English history? And what sort of form might it take were it to exist?
Thank you. Another question. Lucy first.
Thank you. Great think was very suggestive. I have two questions. One was about localism. We've mentioned repeatedly the sort of the sense of place and how powerful that is around football teams or elected mayors, as we're seeing now. And I wondered how that fitted. You know, we're here to look at Englishness, but we've spent quite a lot of time looking at sort of sub-English identities. Perhaps we're looking at the wrong thing. My second question was about liberalism and where that fits in this story. It's an incredibly powerful vehicle for national identity, certainly in the 19th century and arguably for much of the 20th century as well. It fits very well into Tristram's identification of a sort of radical tradition. The rule of law, the role of rights, the preservation of rights as being a uniquely English contribution, and we've seen this really celebrated in the Magna Carta 800th anniversary this year. Arguably, it's also there in the Refugees Welcome campaign, that has been a very powerful grassroots indication of the fact that it's not all about immigration being a negative story, but there are ways in which one can tell a story about asylum that might be rather different. And arguably, this has been a really hard story to tell. If we look back historically, since the 1970s with the challenge of dealing with the troubles in Northern Ireland and the loss of rights during that conflict, around the kind of tabloid-fueled anti-asylum campaigns in the 1990s, and since 2001, war on terror and the challenges to procedural rights that has entailed. So it does seem to me that there's been a sort of historic loss of the place of liberalism, understood with a lowercase l, in this story, and I wondered if you thought that could be put back onto the table for a vehicle for Englishness.
Thank you. Well, we've had questions about, we'll come to some more, but the first set of questions on relations being seen from outside, relating to outside cultures, and also to provincial and ideological traditions within England. So, who are panelists and all that, and this might actually one.
I would just like to respond to the point that Martin Kepler made about class. The point about class and Englishness. I remember in my grammar school in North London when I was growing up there, how strongly the working class kids in that school identified with American culture rather than what one might think of as English culture. And one of them said to me, English culture doesn't mean anything to kids like me, you know, it's not ours, it doesn't belong to us. And so they found American pop culture in particular, and American culture in general, far more congenial to them. This is a pretty large section of the population, presumably, who felt that way. I don't know whether that's still true, and if we were looking at it from the opposite point of view, the Americanization of English culture more generally, with things like Halloween and Black Friday is an absurd thing for the English to have imported. With American football, you have had this traffic coming back this way as well. It also works in the opposite direction. When I talk to American students and others in America about Englishness, they acknowledge a common store of cultural items without very much trouble. Of course, America is very varied and different ethnic groups will differ. The Irish particularly have a very strong view about what England means to them. But other European Americans in particular feel very comfortable with the idea of Englishness as being part of their heritage. They don't think about British and English as being a particularly important distinction, but they have no problems in the view that they are part of a kind of Anglosphere. And I think that's true. Certainly used to be true of Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders. I mean, again, they've tried to find their own identities in their different regions, so it's not perhaps as strong as it used to be. But I do think there is a kind of Englishness that is stronger than the Englishness that might be expressed within Great Britain. And I wonder whether, I just don't quite know how we factor this in. I just don't quite know how we try and talk about an upsurge of Englishness within England itself as against the more generalized Englishness that seems to be in many, many different parts of the world, and which is not seen as in any sense as a matter to be worried about. They seem to be very comfortable with that idea. The fact of the English language being so general across the world, the most useful language to have in the world today, whether you're in China or in Russia or anywhere else, is English, and they know that. So I don't have a specific answer, but I do think these different ways of defining Englishness, both class terms, national terms, and then indeed global terms, are things that I think one ought to be thinking about.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm just, I'll go back to your question beginning and then come back to the other two. I mean, just very quickly, I think this it's a very big question about whether whiteness and national identity, particularly in this context. And all I would say is that it does seem to me that things are much messier and more complicated when you look at the lived experience of people around these sort of issues. And I've certainly been. What really changed my mind in my own thinking about this was reading a study about, I think it was a social psychologist had done, which looked at young men of Pakistani heritage who lived in Manchester and did a lot of quite interesting work about just trying to tease out how did that particular demographic feel and express themselves in relation to these sort of identity categories. And of course, as is the case, and what sort of touches on where Martin made, people don't use these kind of very kind of wooden categories in the way they think and talk. But actually, once the conversation was pursued, what became clear, really struck the researchers, was that essentially, and a number of these guys were saying, well, we're not English in the sense of, those others don't see us as English, but England is the place where we belong, actually. Where else do we belong now? Because Britain is a story that just looks like it's going somewhere else. It doesn't speak to us in the way it may have done to our parents or their generation. And I mean, the second story is that I remember vividly doing a sort of workshop with people, a number of people in Leicester, from very different, mostly non-white people from different minority backgrounds, just talking over these issues, and I got this incredibly strong sense of generational change. That actually, I had a number of people there say to me, my son or my daughter supports England. I just, what's that about? And then the whole room began to concur around this. But those are anecdotal points. It's actually very hard in terms of the data to get very sound evidence about how minority people feel around this identity. My hunch is that there is more than anecdotal evidence to suggest this. I think things are changing, actually. And I think the story is not actually about Englishness is for whites and Britishness is for people from minority background. I think what's happening is that English identity is becoming a more open point of reference for people from a range of ethnic backgrounds, but that is not the case for people from Muslim backgrounds. I think that's where there is a very significant cleavage that appears to be opening up in terms of identity. On Martin's first point, which I have to answer because it's partly directed to me, I think. I mean, let's just say this, Martin. I, as you know, have been talking about this for some years now, and actually lately, in fact, ever since what really since the Scottish referendum, but certainly since the election, I don't get that question anymore. I used to get that question, you know, isn't this something that, in a sense, is being talked up, and if we focus on it, we can kind of exaggerate it. I noticed the terms of discourse shifting markedly. In fact, I've had a number of people, including people from the political parties, say to me, "Oh, actually, you were right. Actually, because of these experiences during the election campaign, seeing the sense of an appeal to an English interest, doing that kind of political work, I think has actually made a lot of people think rather differently about this." That said, I just want to go back to my analysis. I do think hyperbolic talk of an English nationalism is overstated in many respects. What I would want to distinguish here is between I think there is a sort of longer-range cultural process that has gone on. I think there is this sense of interest, territorial interest, which is quite an old one, which has become renewed. And then I think the question about what this means in politics, in terms of, questions about sovereignty and governance, I think that's just incredibly underdeveloped and unclear, actually. And I think, it is quite telling that in certain senses this issue has become dormant because we have a Conservative government that I think for many people in England, reasonably appears to reflect a sense of English interest. With obviously various issues around that, but this is not something that people are necessarily sort of jumping up and demanding in the sense of sovereignty and governance. I think I would call it a kind of half-emergent identity. And just liberalism, Lucy's point, I think it's really, really interesting and important question. And just two ways I'd answer it, partly a historical one and a more contemporary one. I do think there is something about the way in which liberalism develops at the level of political thought. And I'm saying this partly with Julius Stapleton sitting there in his work. I've been very influenced by this. I think something happens in the 20th century whereby liberalism does very broadly bifurcate down towards, and many liberal thinkers begin to move away from the sort of patriotic understandings of the early 20th century, and a certain model of citizenship and rights begins to prevail, which leads to a much more cosmopolitan understanding of those kind of entities. And I think that has left liberalism, very broadly put, quite vulnerable to some of these shifts in the wake of globalisation. That's, but again, the only thing I'd say is on the ground, as it were, I mean, a lot of research seems to me to point to a sort of broadly liberal or liberal/conservative understanding that many people have of this form of identity. I mean, I just suppose I'm pushing back against the sort of UKIP-influenced caricature that the English are just against everyone else. It doesn't feel like that. And when you talk to people about this, those are not the sort of stories that you're hearing. In many ways, I think deep in the popular culture is actually a resumption of that much older lineage.
We'll take a few more questions. There are two gentlemen there and a lady there. Here. Could you two at the back first?
Yeah.
Could you say who you are?
George, I was a Labour councillor here in Cambridge, and also a historian. Just going back to some of the things that Tristram was saying particularly, and giving it a historical kind of slant. I think somebody mentioned, earlier on, the issue of national character, and whether or not national character is a real kind of objective thing that has an existence. I think there's historically been an identification of the English with a kind of sense of being attached to the concrete and the particular and the local, and associating that with a kind of characteristic empiricism. And around about the kind of time of the French Revolution, I think you saw this kind of association between that kind of empiricism and localism being by kind of a dichotomy being drawn between that and a kind of abstract, rational cosmopolitanism. And from that point on, there was an association made with the kind of abstract, cosmopolitan, rationalist side of it, with the what we might call the left, broadly speaking, or the radical side, and the kind of more particular and local with the kind of what you might call the reactionary or the anti-radical side. And I think that one of the problems for the left in England is that association has never really gone away. I think Burke said something along the lines of talking about, I think, Richard Price and the radical people in the 1790s, that they love the whole species, but they don't like any individual member of it, or something along those lines. And I wonder whether, and I think maybe this comes to the front with the current Labour Party, and particularly our current leadership, is that one of the problems is that a lot of particularly English people in the provinces, very much stick to this, or in their self-image, still stick to this kind of view of themselves as attached to the local and the particular, and be very much suspicious of abstract notions and kind of cosmopolitan ideals, which may, to some degree, explain why Labour maintains its power in big cities with a more global outlook, places like London and Manchester and so on. But we really struggle in anywhere in England outside those big cities, in any provincial area. And I just wondered if that kind of association and that kind of self-consciousness of the kind of characteristics that define England in the provinces is one of the big problems for Labour.
Richard Johnson, I'm a graduate student at Nuffield College, Oxford. I would second that, and I would take it even to a closer level. So the social anthropologist Kate Fox has done some some wonderful work watching the English, and she talks about a grammar of Englishness, which she says is sort of a set of unwritten codes which remain enigmatic yet decipherable, recognisable, and can be applied. And so when she says when it comes to the grammar of Englishness, that consists of a sort of social awkwardness, moderation, humour, Eorishness, class consciousness, values of fair play, politeness, modesty, self-deprecation, and a bit of hypocrisy. And I think to most English people that sounds extremely recognisable. The question is there a political dimension to that? Does there need to be a political dimension to that? English people see themselves in these lived out behaviours, as Michael Kenny was saying. Does there need to be an institutional manifestation of that, or should it remain at that level? I would just say on the love affair with America, my research in America, I lived in America, and we would bring working class members of my family to America, and I can't say that it was quite a love affair with America. I think the impact of globalization and Americanization is quite superficial, often exaggerated and misinterpreted. And I'd say in spite of our taste for McDonald's or corporate promotions of Black Friday, if anything, globalization deepens tribal attachments that people have. And there was a wonderful quote in Kate Fox's book, which she said she interviewed someone who had been sitting next to an American on a train, and said, what did you make of him? And he said, well, the trouble with Americans is they have no fucking subtlety. And I think that sort of captures it.
Apologies to all America.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Claire Letra, French Embassy. Thank you for the brilliant presentations. I must say I'm a little bit struck by the fact that religion is not really doesn't seem to be a defining feature of this new Englishness. So none of you really mentioned it. Well, I'm wrong because Mr. Kumar touched this point. But isn't it a bit surprising, given that after the reform, religion has been a defining and specifically anti-French factor, but very powerful defining factor of English identity, and I think not only English identity, because of course anti-Catholicism has been something that has brought together the English and the Scots, so it's also a defining feature of British identity in a way. And I understand that it was still lively a few years ago, because I met here in the UK a few people that told me that the fact that the founding treaty of the European construction was named Treaty of Rome was seen as a Papist conspiracy. So is this completely over, and as secularism has had the last word here in the UK? Or do you think that religion could still become part of this conversation about Englishness? And do you think that the increased focus on the Muslim community and of course Islam could alter this situation?
We're getting three sets of questions, one about localism, the concrete and the abstract, one about cultural codes and identity, and one about religion, which I think Tristram touched on briefly. So again, could our panel members like to respond to those?
Yes, I mean, I think on religion and national identity, that is one of the striking changes, particularly from a Labour Party point of view. One of the sort of one of the elements of the ecological or cultural collapse of labourism is the collapse of nonconformist Protestantism. And in Stoke-on-Trent, this was where Wesley came in the 1780s, a very strong centre of working class Methodism, very strong nonconformist base, and the chapels are being bulldozed almost as we speak. And that's been stripped away. I think in Scotland, as it were, I haven't got the figures, but a much stronger political identity around Catholicism in Scotland is a powerful part. And again, the collapse of Protestantism in Scotland has influenced the Labour vote and has influenced a sense of British identity. The Union was closely linked to orange orders and orange clubs, and that whole component has gone. And you're not wrong about the Treaty of Rome. I think the Reverend Ian Paisley was quite clear on how that all fitted together. And that's where you still have a sense of where religion and identity in Ulster. You still, and in the speeches of colleagues from Ulster in the Commons, you still have that biblical sensibility. You still have those rhythms. Let me just touch on the point about Labour and also, as it were, liberalism, because I'm going to Oldham tomorrow, and I'll tell you what they'll tell me in Oldham, that what we offered at the general election was liberalism, pure and simple. What is on the front page of the Mail and the Sun today? It's the fact that Britain had net inward migration figures of 330,000 last year. And we can all write those stories about the Huguenots and Asian Africans and Caribbean and the story of Britain and its change. But I think to suggest that what has happened in the last 10 years, the last 10 to 15 years, in terms of migration, in terms of the change to the UK, to say that you can put this just in historical context, and it's really underestimates what has happened and the political consequences of it and the anger about it. And the Labour Party is regarded as letting them all in, and regarded as liberals. And the consequence of that is that in parts of Northern England, Northern Labour is as brittle as Scottish Labour, because many of those communities are low-income communities who have felt the force of energetic, well-qualified East European migrants. And to go to your point about ethnicity and migration, I have second-generation Pakistani heritage, British citizens in Stoke-on-Trent, really worrying about the impact of Lithuanian, Polish migration, white people in the UK, undermining their ability to do, to get a job and build a family and have a career. So our inability and unwillingness to speak about that was why those sort of the reason why Gordon Brown calling Gillian Duffy a bigoted woman in Rochdale, I mean, it just sort of symbolised every fear. And then Emily Thornberry tweeting, remarkable about someone with English flags on their house. Every visceral fear about what the sort of the liberalism of the Labour Party stood for just came alive. And that's what, these moments aren't just media conflations. The media plays a role in it, but they speak to a truth that people are worried about, and that's why they take off. The answer to this is tough and complicated, and we can have the conversation about clamping down on welfare contributions and all the rest of it. It's a minor point. We can have the conversation about being part of the European Union, but we have to explain the modern world, explain the nature of migration, explain this isn't going away, but then support those communities really not far from here who you know, if parents can't get their kid into the local school because suddenly, you know, if you can't get an appointment at the GP, you're not going to feel this is a great contribution to English culture. Actually, you're going to be angry, and you're going to find a voice for that anger.
About two things. One, the local cosmopolitan kind of I think that's an interesting one that can be read a number of ways. There is the empirical versus rational one that you mentioned, and of course the left in England has always had a problem about patriotism, about whether it's patriotic. I mean, particularly if they were followers of Karl Marx, they had an even greater problem as communists about whether they could be truly English and be a part of an international working class movement. And they found various ways of dealing with that. I think people like William Morris, I thought, found a wonderful way of dealing with it. But there's another kind of local cosmopolitan axis which I think allowed the English to square the circle. And actually there's a literary historian, Ian Walker, who's written very well about this in a book called Out of Place, the Locations of Englishness. It's a study of literature mostly, 19th and 20th century literature. What he shows is a kind of alternation between a stress on the very local, the very concrete, the very regional, a kind of Wordsworthian concern of place, particular places and the values that go there. And at the same time, an expansion outwards to the world, mainly through the empire. This is what's interesting about his book, is that it's not just the world as a whole, but Englishness could be taken abroad. You're not giving up on it, you're just globalizing it. So, you know, and Tristan has written this wonderful book about imperial cities, precisely. Englishness in Cape Town, Englishness in New Delhi, Englishness in Christchurch and Canterbury, New Zealand. That kind of Englishness could be expressed abroad without it necessarily contradicting the stress on the regional, the local, and the concrete. So there was a way, I think, in which Englishness didn't have to choose between those two. There was a way in which it could be squared. And then the point about Kay Fox's book and Watching the English, which I agree is a very interesting book. I mean, there's a whole tradition here of stating a series of values or virtues or aptitudes that go with Englishness. You know, John Betjeman did it, George Eliot did it, George Orwell, T.S. Eliot. There's a whole tradition of that. But what strikes me there is that what's often stated as Englishness can just as easily be stated as Britishness. I think when Gordon Brown was going on about Britishness, everybody noticed that his kind of list of British values were not that different from George Orwell's list of English values and a whole series of others. So the problem of separating Englishness from Britishness seems to be really acute in the national character kind of thing. You know, is the bulldog British or English? British bulldog, English bulldog? Sometimes a bit hard. It's John Bull. I suppose John Bull is English. But sometimes he seems to be in Jack Class or whatever, and he seems British. So that problem, I think, is one that really afflicts this attempt to state Englishness in terms of content. You know, I talked here about the way in which the traditions, some of them are very intent on national character, what makes up the content. That would include religion, when Protestantism was seen as a central thing in the makeup of the English. Maybe non-conformist Protestantism. But then, in the college says, Protestantism was the centre of the British identity as well. So again, I think the problem separating English from British is really acute around religion, but also around most things. So I think, you know, these questions tend to often to make it more difficult to define Englishness than to help to do so.
Krishan, I can't help noticing you're drinking English water. Flag of St. George and water. Robert has special.
Even me. One thing I've got was bottles of water.
This is what we find in this John's buttery. That's them.
Well, Mike, do you want to add anything? And then we'll stop this session, or shall we? Well, lots of people want to ask questions, but there's plenty of time this afternoon. So I think we're going to break for lunch now, which is down in the Lightfoot room, and then we'll be back here promptly at whatever time it is, 1:30. So thank you all so far.